Welcome, everyone, to the third episode of Conservative Conversations with ISI, a new videocast series exploring the meaning and contemporary state of American conservatism with a range of thought-provoking guests. My name is Jeff Nelson. I'm the Institute's Senior Vice President and your host for this episode of Conservative Conversations with ISI. I hope you'll enjoy the next 60 minutes as together we talk to, ask questions of, and of course learn from our guest, Daniel McCarthy, on the topic American conservatism, living tradition, or dead consensus. It's a pleasure to have Dan with us. I know we have a biography of him probably on the screen, but let me just introduce him formally, briefly to you all. Dan is the editor of Modern Age, which we're going to talk a lot about, so I won't go much into that other than flash Modern Age. Let's see, can I go on this side, yes, or that side? Anyway, Modern Age, there it is. There's your visual for now. We'll talk more about it in a minute. Dan is also as a day job, is the director of the very important Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies, one of our great sister organizations, a very important, really indispensable organization in the conservative movement. He previously served as editor of the American Conservative. He did way more than that. He reimagined the American Conservative magazine for a whole new generation, drawing on all sorts of disparate tendencies, many of them forgotten within the conservative tradition, to make the American Conservatives an indispensable, lively, creative magazine. And it remains so today. And it does so really very much because of what Dan did to turn the American Conservative around and make it such a great magazine. I really couldn't emphasize that enough. And I know the American Conservatives appreciate Dan, and we appreciate him now doing much of the same for Modern Age as we go forward. Dan is a columnist for The Spectator USA, which you may want to check out his regular column there. It's always interesting. He writes for everybody, all the top publications, New York Times, USA Today, et cetera. He's interviewed in all the posh places, BBC, et cetera. And it's important to say as an ISIer that he is an alumnus of ISI, where he edited an ISI Collegiate Network student newspaper at his undergraduate alma mater, Washington University in St. Louis. So if any of you students out there, and I know there are a lot of you, on the webinar today, want to be like Dan, maybe one of the first places you can turn to is a collegiate network. Look into starting your own student paper on your campus, and an adventure in journalism may just commence. So, and I should say one thing I was thinking of that I wanted to say at bottom with Dan, and then we'll go right into questions. As he is, quite frankly, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many others, one of the most consequential conservative editors of his generation. And I'll say that with an exclamation point. And I'm really great to have him working with ISI as editor of Modern Age now in that capacity, and bringing all his immense talents and all his knowledge to bear, and making this journal now such another indispensable publication of the conservative movement. So Dan, that was a little lengthier introduction than I thought, but you deserve it if anybody does. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And now you've set me up so high that I'm afraid I'm going to fall very low. So, but it's a great beginning. Pressure so
tends to lead to performance, so I'm comfortable. All right, so let me just start in a broad way and talking to you with a kind of an ISI question, or at least approaching it in an ISI way. Since 1964. Each year, the applicants to ISI's Richard M. Weaver Graduate Fellowship Program include among their several required essays an intellectual autobiography. This piece of the application is always of interest, mostly of interest to the judges, as it gives them an appreciation of an applicant's principal intellectual and institutional influences. If Dan McCarthy were to apply next year for an ISI Graduate Fellowship, how would he describe for the judges the making of his conservative mind?
Well, I first became interested in political thought, as many people do, I think, through politics itself. I was in high school between 1992 and 1996, about 25 years ago now. And that era was actually remarkably similar to today. It was a time when conservatives were rethinking what they stood for. you had George H.W. Bush on the one hand, but you also had Pat Buchanan challenging him in the 1992 primaries, and then you had a struggle in the 1996 primaries as well. Libertarianism, neoconservatism, traditional conservatism, all of these things were in play. And you could see certain political expressions of them back in the early to mid 1990s. And I became very interested in this. It seemed much more intellectually lively than what was happening on the Clintonite left, which was basically just sort of repudiating its old, sort of Marxist roots and socialist roots, but that hadn't really settled on anything new other than just kind of do your own thing and, sort of enjoy, the prosperity of, a country that your parents and grandparents had built up, but that you yourself might not be contributing very much to. So liberalism at that time, Clintonite liberalism, seemed very low in its demands upon people's efforts. And conservatism, on the other hand, seemed very intellectually demanding, very fascinating. And so I would follow the threads and try to learn about these different schools of conservative thought. And ISI was instrumental in helping me to develop. And in particular, ISI Books, the publishing division, which was fairly new at that time, it was edited by some guy you've probably never heard of, Jeff Nelson, I think was his name.
It's a very common name.
I don't know whatever happened to him. I think he's probably, I don't know if he's still around. But in any case, he did great work back then. He published a number of books that showed aspects of American history and American political thought that had been overlooked for a generation or more. This included a book like The Republication of Who Owns America, which was a collection of writings by people who might be called Southern agrarians or fugitive poets, people who had a certain critical take on industrial modernity, and also a book called The Superfluous Men that was published around 1999. It was edited by a fellow by the name of Robert Crunden, and it was a compilation of essays by people like George Santayana, Albert J. Nock, H.L. Mencken, Ralph Adams Cram, and many others. And it was a look into the intellectual ferment of the American right, or American conservatives loosely understood, in the era before World War II. And it was just a fascinating window into a part of the American mind which you would never learn about in the college classroom. And so, as I followed these threads, I found myself finding traditionalist conservatism to be the most sort of rigorous and I think the most wholly human philosophical position, and at least in politics. And these books that I had been consuming as a student affiliated with ISI and as the editor of a Collegiate Network publication, they were the driving intellectual influence on me. And I knew after that that this is something I wanted to dedicate my whole life's work to, that I wanted to continue promoting these ideas and contribute to this great tradition of which I had benefited so greatly.
Well, you certainly realized that aspiration. When was the first time you came across Modern Age, just out of curiosity?
It would have been when I was an undergraduate. At the time, there was Modern Age, and also the Intercollegiate Review was published in a format very similar to Modern Age. Mm-hmm. And ISI did a great job of distributing both of them. And both of those publications had an influence. And they were, several notches above just the kind of common political magazines that people would be used to seeing at the bookstores. Modern Age, in particular, had a kind of a depth to it. It brought a perspective of eternity and a perspective of the ages into the politics of the present day and the culture of the present day. And I've tried to live up to that tradition as the editor of Modern Age.
Well, to that point, actually, I'd like to read a couple lines from the very first number of Modern Age. It's summer of 1957, which I guess is 63 years ago. I was reading over it, just kind of curious. I haven't read it in a long time, and I thought, I probably could ask a question. I read a few lines and ask the audience who wrote this, Russell Kirk or Dan McCarthy. There's just some tremendous elements of continuity, but for the audience's sake, Modern Age was founded in 1957 by Russell Kirk, who 4 years before had published The Conservative Mind, which is seminal work in our tradition, of course. And he had wanted for several years to set up a humanistic review and a review of letters and ideas and culture. And finally, in 1957, was able to do so. So he He wrote a few lines in this number, and I'd like you to reflect on it, just with the topic that we'll start getting into a little bit more as we move on, of the idea of tradition and living tradition. Think of your own place, because you're the sixth editor, I believe, aren't you, of Modern Age? I could have one off maybe, but I think that's right. That's not that many. 1957, a journal of ideas, conservative ideas like that, going on nearly 7 decades now. It's quite remarkable. So I'd like to kind of your thoughts about your thinking, your approach to editing in Modern Age with the founder's approach, some continuities and maybe some discontinuities. But anyway, Russell Kirk wrote, and then in the summer of 57, quote, "By conservative, we mean a journal dedicated to conserving the best elements in our civilization. And those best elements are in peril nowadays. We confess to a prejudice against doctrinaire radical alteration and to a preference for the wisdom of our ancestors. Beyond this, we have no party line. Our purpose is to stimulate discussion of the great moral and social and political and economic and literary questions of the hour, and to search for means by which the legacy of our civilization may be kept safe." That's part one. That's the universal part. And the particular part, I think, also applies to Dan McCarthy and what you were doing, particularly, especially at the American Conservative. He says, quote, "Published in Chicago, our journal may also serve to represent opinion in the heart of America and to link the Middle West and South and West with the Eastern United States," that other part, "and with the world overseas." So I guess the Midwest was the heart of not just America, but the world. And then finally, in terms of what you might read in the next number of Modern Age and what came out in that first edition, you had Richard Weaver, but then you had an essay by the classical liberal journalist Felix Morley called "American Republic or American Empire." And you had another essay by the great neo-Thomist, and a decade later, the foremost integralist of the 1960s and 70s, probably ever, Frederick Williamson, on the modern mind and the betrayal of the West. Now, how much more contemporary can we get for a publication of the summer of 1957? And here you are inheriting all that. You're a steward. I know you're conserving and changing, but when you hear that as an editor today, what goes through your mind? What are you thinking?
Well, it'd be nice to say that this is an affirmation of the permanent things, but it's also just an affirmation of sort of a continuing crisis in our country. And it can be very easy for young people today looking at, whether it's the shutdown as a result of the COVID-19 virus, whether it's, the sort of protests and the riots in the streets right now, whether it's the problem with our institutions, our educational establishment, perhaps our, certain elements of government that are doing things that are detrimental to the liberties of the citizens. All of that may seem like it's very new, very daunting, and kind of leaves the young person today with no resources to draw upon. But in fact, even in the 1950s, conservatives felt very much the same way, and Russell Kirk felt very much the same way. And that was not a source of despair to these early conservatives like Kirk and Weaver and Felix Morley. It was instead a source of inspiration, a source of motivation. It made them go out there and want to do the best work they possibly could as a creative minority, and as people who were going to stand up for values which were already out of fashion in the academy and in much of the American elite. And so, I'm familiar with the first issue of Modern Age myself. It's something whose wisdom I occasionally return to refresh kind of the well springs of my own inspiration. And so I would emphasize the continuity there. I think that we're very much trying to keep not only the ethos going, but I think that the same difficulties, civilizational difficulties, the same root problems that Modern Age was founded to deal with in 1957 are still the ones that we're dealing with in 2020.
Oh, yeah. As he said, the best elements are in peril nowadays. I mean, the permanent things for the good and all the things you mentioned. Well said. I think today it seems that an important way that editing Modern Age is not just an exercise in arguing what we are for, but relitigating sometimes old battles. One in particular today concerns whether or not liberalism is the only American tradition. So we're talking about tradition. Russell Kirk, who we just mentioned, battled that thesis as articulated in the influential work of Louis Hartz of that generation. It seems to me you're confronted with it anew on the conservative side from the usual liberal suspects, and now from the so-called post-liberals. want to argue the same thing. So Dan, does America have a conservative tradition? Is Hart circling? Is Hart coming back more relevant today, or is Kirk?
Well, I would say Kirk is. No, I mean, the conservatism of the American founding, the American colonial experience, the early American Republic, all of this tends to be neglected, not only in sort of mainstream education, but also in terms of even the way conservatives think. Too many conservatives have become very concerned about what's happening right now in politics and have tended to lose track of their own roots and have oftentimes kind of accepted by default a narrative that has been created by progressives about America's origins. You know, America had, of course, very strongly religious origins, that sort of not just Puritan spirit, but that whole idea of self-governing communities that are under God. That didn't go away when the Constitution was adopted, far from it. That continued to be very much the informing spirit of America well into the 19th century. And there were always counter-influence as well. You know, someone like Thomas Jefferson did have a certain Jacobin side to him. But even that would now, of course, be considered probably on the right, considering how far toward a progressive direction things have moved in a sort of postmodern direction. So America had, in its origins, a mix of ideas, but among them were quite solidly conservative ideas. And if you look at the first two American administrations, George Washington and John Adams, both of them, by European standards, would be considered conservative in the sense that they were opposed to the French Revolution. They did not want to support the Jacobin cause. Thomas Jefferson sort of did. And the Conservative Party that gets founded in Britain in the 1830s, so a little bit after the French Revolution and after Napoleon, is precisely a party that is consisting of the elements in the British polity who were opposed to the French Revolution and to Jacobinism and so forth. So the same matrix in America is what you found informing the Federalist Party, informing the Washington administration and the Adams administration. And even though the Federalist Party itself then goes into a kind of long decline after the Adams administration, obviously Federalist ideas linger on. They linger on in someone like John Marshall on the federal bench. They linger on in someone like John Quincy Adams moving into Jefferson's party. And they later on become part of the informing spirit of the Whig Party and indeed the early Republican Party.
Yeah, some of this kind of loss of this historical memory or memory has to be due to the corruption of the teaching of history. But even within conservative circles, there's always been a kind of overemphasis or tendency on theory as opposed to history and practice. There's sort of, sometimes I've always felt as a historian that there's a kind of tyranny of theory occasionally in the conservative circles. Even Richard Weaver's great book is ideas have consequences, very Platonic, et cetera, which is great. It's a great book, but I mean, how do we sort of reconnect young people to their tradition? I mean, really connect them to the things that matter, get them invested in, excited, even sort of feeling romantic once again about being a conservative in America and the kind of intellectual genealogy that exists and that's there for them, not just as a dead letter, but something very much living and relevant.
Well, I think there's a tremendous hunger for it. So in a sense, it's easy if you simply make the resources available and make them not just, don't present them in a way that seems as if it's only for students or only for people who are not intellectually formed, but really bring the students into conversations with senior scholars and make them part of a community which is already dealing with the deepest roots of conservatism and with our history as well as our philosophy. I can point to a couple of libertarian organizations, for example, that did, I think, an exemplary job over the last few decades. Liberty Fund, of course, which is a partner with ISI on a number of educational programs. One of the most influential that I attended was back around the year 2000. It was in my senior year as an undergraduate. And it was a symposium on liberty and order with Stan Evans, who is a great legendary libertarian wit, and George Carey, a professor at Georgetown University, who was one of the outstanding original conservative thinkers of the post-war era. And it was a symposium of students, about 15 or so, who came together, and we had readings from a book called Liberty and Virtue, which is published by ISI Books. It was edited by George Carey. And it looked at many of the questions that are still of burning interest to a number of young people today. So, for example, the question of fusionism versus a Catholic conservatism. Well, this was taken up in a debate between Frank Meyer, the original fusionist, and Brent Bozell, who was very much what would now be called an integralist. They had this debate, and it was originally appeared in National Review in the 1960s. It got republished in this book, Liberty and Virtue, which is still available from ISI. And in the year 2000, we had this symposium to discuss it. So Liberty Fund is just like ISI, has done a great job of keeping a number of things in print, including a 50-year anniversary collection of Modern Age. It's about 1,000 pages long. It's a huge book, but it's available on their website. And as are, just an enormous amount of historical resources about not just classical liberal, but also conservative thinking. I think so. ISI, Liberty Fund, a number of other organizations. I think back in the 1990s and 2000s, a group like the Mises Institute did a very good job of making the intellectual resources and tradition of Austrian economics available on their website and available broadly to students. And it's amazing how students would find these materials themselves and would organize their own reading groups. It was very much self-driven. It was something where you didn't have to, sort of compel people to adopt your point of view the way that the left often does. It was rather that people are genuinely curious. How does an economy work? What are America's historical roots? What is, a Catholic view of political philosophy? What is, the Enlightenment, and what are its different sort of divisions in schools? These are questions that often are not being answered by the kind of education people are getting in the classroom, especially as you find a kind of heckler's veto coming to pass in classrooms where students who might be offended by some sort of investigation into history or philosophy or sort of searching and probing questions are now trying to sort of get professors to shut up and not discuss anything about the world before it became as soft and comfortable as it is today. So I think that just continuing to make these resources available, continuing to have discussions like we're having tonight, and to bring people together, even with the COVID-19 disease, even still to have whatever conferences you can to give people a chance to discuss in person the great books, and not just the great books that everyone is familiar with, but also lesser known works by the great authors. All of this is a kind of it's a self-generating virtuous cycle. It's something where you really don't have to bully people into going your way. That in fact, there's a deeper hunger for this tradition than we often realize.
No, I totally agree. A quote from one of my old teachers, a great religious historian, Yaroslav Pelikan, came to mind when just this afternoon, thinking about tonight, where he said, quote, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living." And it's traditionalism that gives tradition a bad name. And I think that's that distinction is kind of lost sometimes among those that want to criticize the conservative tradition. I focus on the traditionalism part of it, and one of the areas where that comes into play you just mentioned is this whole issue of fusionism. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about it, because you kind of glossed over it. But I think that in the sights of some conservatives who see too many contemporary conservatives as sort of lost in the 80s, sort of stuck with a traditionalism that's dead faith, and zombie Reaganites, whatever. But they pin the tail on the donkey of fusionism as being sort of the bad, the element there where we're all still hooked in, and it's very dead, and there's nothing living, so I'm kind of curious from what you're thinking with what is the state. Of course, permanence and change are always happening at the same time. So what was considered to be, working with combining the elements of freedom and virtue in the 60s and 70s and 80s may not be exactly the same in the 2000s. But do you still see some kind of role for, even if it's just prudential or strategic, for a kind of fusionism, a new or a revised old? Well,
if anything, I would say it should not be simply opportunistic or for the sake of political convenience. I mean, that's going to happen in politics anyway. Coalitions are, part of the nature of the kind of political system that we have. So people will always form alliances and try to get across their policies however they can. But what Frank Meyer, the original fusionist, was actually trying to do was to embark on a philosophical project. And it was an investigation. It was not, Meyer could be dogmatic. He could sometimes, lay out a kind of libertarian line that he expected everyone to sign on to. But the better part of his work, the part that's sort of more redeeming and that should be rediscovered, was a search for what the place of liberty is within the Western tradition, including within the Christian tradition. And Meyer himself had, he came out of, he was Jewish by birth. He became a communist. He became an atheist. And then he found his way to faith and eventually converted to the Catholic faith. So Meyer's own life trajectory is kind of a mirror for what he was doing with his philosophy as well in politics. He was rejecting the evils of Marxism and of communism. He was questioning the roots of liberalism and trying to say, how can you get what is sort of the gold out of the dross? How can you find a liberty that is consistent with virtue, and a virtue that is also consistent with the kind of liberty that exists in the modern world? And this, of course, is something that Alexis de Tocqueville was also very concerned about. And I think there's a tendency, just as fusionism gets reduced to a mere political formula, there's a tendency for people to also look at Tocqueville and kind of see only the kind of happy and optimistic elements about sort of local communities and the idea that, sort of liberty and equality and freedom can all and virtue can all work together. And in fact, there's a dark side to Tocqueville. And I really recommend that people read, in addition to Democracy in America, his short work on the old regime and the French Revolution. And really look at the way in which a society can become unwound as not only a sense of virtue, but also political responsibility is evacuated from local institutions and local authorities and is assumed by a centralized authority, which itself then loses its legitimacy with the public and becomes what leads to what is then a revolutionary situation, which then leads to enormous violence, starting with protests in the streets. That's how the French Revolution begins. It doesn't begin with the guillotine. It begins with, a number of protests that are much more contained. Then you get the guillotine after that. And then, of course, you eventually get the man on horseback, Napoleon, thereafter. So, fusionism is worth reinvestigating as an approach to Western history, as an approach to philosophical investigation. And I would say, don't worry so much about the political coalitions of the 60s or 70s or 80s. You'll create the kind of political coalition you need now, just automatically by the nature of politics. But there's a need for something much deeper than politics. There's a need for real philosophical investigation and for revisiting what these minds like Brent Bozell and Frank Meyer were trying to do and why they were in communication with one another as well. It's not as if Brent Bozell ever came around to Frank Meyer's point of view, but there's a reason why Bozell valued Meyer's friendship, even when they argued very vehemently. And there's a reason why National Review featured back in the 60s all of these thinkers of very different points of view.
Yeah, they were talking. Apparently, they were talking about every night between about 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. That was Meyer time. I don't know how Bozell held up with that, but apparently Meyer thrived nocturnally.
Meyer had, my guess is that Meyer was really just a congenital night owl. But his explanation for this was always that because he had actually been in the Communist Party and he had left the party, that he was afraid of getting assassinated, that the KGB might actually come for him one night. So that was how he got into his late night habits, and then I guess they stuck from there.
I want to just mention to the audience that we're going to come down in just probably about 5 minutes to start opening up question and answers. If you look up at the top of your bar, you'll see Q&A right to the right of the chat. Drop a question, just go to Q&A, type it in. You may not be able to see it after you hit it, or you won't see everybody else's, but don't worry, I'll see it. It'll be there. Trust is a must. Just submit, and it's a conservative orientation, and we'll be happy to read those to Dan. Another question for me beforehand is, I think many the momentum on the right for many seems to be toward a more assertive role of the state. There are parallels for this on the right and the left. There is less expressed apprehension about centralized government and statist planning. Some on the right now are even calling on conservatives to baptize the administrative state, so to speak, to better achieve conservative ends. But a defining characteristic of American conservatives has been the deep suspicion of concentrated power. The belief that concentrated power is dangerous is quintessentially American. What's going on in here? Please.
Well, I mean, part of it is symptomatic of the loss of local cohesion and local authority and responsibility. So when it seems as if there's very little that can be done at the local level to resolve, in some cases they are, sort of very broad and abstract problems. In some cases they may be, problems as simple as, crime in the streets. But when it seems as if local authorities are unable to meet the needs of society, there is this tendency to say, well, let's go to some sort of centralized authority in Washington, D.C. to provide what we are missing. And again, I would cite the French Revolution and the old regime by Tocqueville. And, this is something we've seen happen before in many different instances. What it seems to me that conservatives have to do is to try to reestablish local authority. And it's not a romantic localism. It's not saying that there aren't problems at the local level. It's not saying that there's no need for the federal government or for state governments. In fact, the great need for the federal government and for state governments is precisely to protect localities and to make sure that economically and in terms of their authority structures, they are secure against powers that are much vaster and that would totally override and overwhelm any kind of local order that would overwhelm the family, that would overwhelm the neighborhood, and that would overwhelm local self-government. I mean, these are all the things that Americans going back to the colonial era had considered to be the essence of America. And to the extent that you dismantle these organizations or simply let them fall into disrepair, what you wind up doing is creating a vacuum that then gets filled by a number of ideologues, a number of people who have very simple solutions to difficult problems, and by sorts of power which are basically going to just make matters worse by continuing to take away the responsibilities of the local units and responsibilities of families, responsibilities of individuals, and instead give these responsibilities to bureaucrats. And it's not that bureaucracy is avoidable. It's not that you can. It's not that it has no place whatsoever. But you have to be careful that it's not displacing the subsidiary institutions that are supposed to be the sort of warp and weft of ordinary life, the little platoons that Edmund Burke had referred to.
I think in some ways, in opposition to some of this movement toward more aggressive forms of more concentrated forms of power, then there has been a swing in the ways that you suggested. I'm thinking in particular of the American project at Pepperdine, where they're talking about more of explicitly more about developing a conservatism of connection. Pete Peterson and Ted McAllister, who and many others, and they're talking more. And you don't hear as much about the whole fostering of the proliferation of intermediate associations the way that maybe you did. I mean, you're articulating it, and you're a loud voice in favor of it, which is great. But generally speaking, I don't think hear as much of it. But during a time in which newly energized forms of nationalism and populism seem to be getting all the attention, how can conservatives encourage even more the even more vital work of what Burke called the little platoons or the smaller patriotisms?
I think what's driving nationalism and populism right now is a rejection of something that's even more anti-localist, which is namely globalism, and the idea that an abstract left-wing ideology that certainly an elite within this country, but also an elite in other countries, that there is this sort of transnational mentality of progressivism, which is going to now run roughshod over nation states and then over everything that's below the nation state. So there is this need to get a correct mixture of authorities, both at the national level and at the local level. And that's what I think conservatives are called to do right now. I work on a number of issues, foreign policy, a number of sort of big questions, which by their nature tend to be affiliated with the nation state and that level of concern. But there are other places, such as the Front Porch Republic website, for example, which a number of ISI folks have been involved with, which are focusing on precisely those most local elements. And I think the difficulty is to connect these two things. You don't want a nationalism that is going to destroy localism. You also, however, need a localism that is not simply romantic about the need or about the lack of a need for any kind of larger scale national defense of local communities. So there's this work of integrating the national and the local That's, I think, one of the great challenges facing conservatism today. And there's a tendency for conservatives to focus either exclusively on one side or on the other, or at least to overemphasize one side or another of this continuum. And in fact, the difficulty, as in all things, is to have this kind of not just either or, but rather the comprehensive good that is both of these different levels of society.
Oh, well said. Clearly, an ingredient of your success as an editor is your ability to reconcile these kind of disparate tendencies to hold them in balance. We'll move to questions now. So several of you have put some in. Let me first pause for a quick word from our sponsor, of course, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and we're talking to students and to faculty in a minute as well. But very briefly, students, are you tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus? Those isolated islands of liberal learning that are engulfed in a sea of identity politics? Are you eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom? You can learn the timeless principles that Dan's been talking about of liberty so that you can pursue truth and freedom and explore the deepest and best wisdom of our civilization. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of ordered liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and discover a community they don't find at their universities. And in the process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. To get the education you deserve, become a member today. Join. You can go to our website. You can. I think there's a link above. It's join.isi.org. That's join.isi.org. There's all kinds of benefits. Dan mentioned the publications that influenced him, the books that influenced him, great discounts, great publications, invitations to amazing seminars, including Liberty Fund seminars, as Dan mentioned. So there's all sorts of connections and opportunities to deepen yourself intellectually and to connect with fellow conservative students if you join ISI. And faculty, we want you to join as well. There's a faculty button. We're every month sending out notices, opportunities, book discounts, invitations to events. Soon, Modern Age will be a premium for faculty membership. I haven't flashed this recently, but I will do it again. Modern Age is a premium for faculty. So if you're faculty you want to join, now is a good time. You'll be getting Dan 4 times a year, plus all his spectator columns and everything else. So join.isi.org, students and faculty. Okay, a word from our sponsor. Dan mentioned Liberty Fund. I mentioned Liberty Fund. I'm going to go to a question from one of the great Liberty funders, Steve Ely, who asks, Dan, what is the relation between political thought and practical politics? In this regard, does George Will's recent critique of Republican congressional leadership reflect a conservative sensibility?
Well, George Will has, I think, become rather embittered over the years. And, he maintains, a high intellectual level, but I think he's also sort of failed to show a continuity in his thought between his earlier days of writing a book like Statecraft is Soulcraft and his more recent work on the conservative imagination. George Will is someone who I find interesting to read, provocative, but I do wonder whether he has become sort of so curmudgeonly right now that he's unable to deal with the actual problems facing the country. And what are those problems? Well, again, you can have whatever opinion you feel is proper about the Trump administration. But I think the undeniable thing is that Donald Trump won the election in 2016 for a reason. And that reason goes much deeper than immediate politics, the personalities of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. It really goes down fundamentally to questions about, first of all, whether large enough segments of America felt as if they were getting economic policies that were not really representative of what their needs were. It goes to the question of, in terms of our foreign policy, whether we had a kind of Wilsonian, idealistic, sort of progressive liberal approach to what we were doing in the world, even under Republican administrations as well as under Democratic ones. And in terms of simple questions like citizenship, the nation state, American federalism, the right to keep and bear arms, all of these sort of fundamental questions about our polity were at stake in the 2016 election. And again, politicians have different personalities and different flaws, and their personalities can be things that we find objectionable. But I think ultimately you have to keep your eye on what these fundamental questions are leading to. And it seems to me that different sides in our politics have very different directions in which they would like to take the country. And actually, when I look at the Trump administration, I see plenty of things to criticize, but I actually also see a lot that I think is has exceeded expectations. There's a lot of good things that have been happening in terms of judges. There's a lot of good things that have been happening in terms of religious liberty. Other kinds of regulations that have been detrimental to business have also been addressed. And in terms of our foreign policy, we haven't had the kind of adventurism that characterized the interventions over the last 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Libya. So all of those things, I think, are big improvements. And I think George Will, who's actually criticized a few of those things, especially in foreign policy, should stop and think about the extent to which this president is actually achieving some of the things that George Will himself has said are necessary.
All right. We have a question from Doug Kruschke. I'm sorry, Doug, if I didn't say that quite right, but it's a good question. What do you see as the positive and negative impacts of, quote, common good conservatism a la Douthat, Reno, and others on traditional conservatism?
I think so far it's been overwhelmingly positive, simply in getting conservatives once again to think about the question of what the common good is and what institutions are able to serve it at all levels of our society. There had been a tendency, first of all, just in politics, to think of conservatism in purely negative terms. That a conservative is simply whoever's opposing a Democrat at a given time, or whoever's opposing a certain progressive liberalism at a given time. And the common good conservatism has said, wait a minute, no, you actually do need to have an idea about the nature of society and what its good is and how you're going to fulfill that. That has to be part of your philosophical outlook as well as your political program. And you can't simply be opposed to something and expect that you're going to succeed in, sort of satisfying the needs of our Commonwealth by doing so. So far, I don't see a lot of downsides. I think that there is this tendency when common good conservatives are talking to, conservatives who may style themselves as classical liberals or as libertarians. There's a tendency for things to get kind of hung up on labels and on basically straw man understandings of each side, which are mistaken. I think really what you need to say is, wait a minute, what vision of the good do these libertarians actually have? What critique can you make of it on the grounds of its own principles as well as on the grounds of the principles of other traditions? And then how can you persuade, not just Hector, people who have a different set of views than you do, that they should come around to your way of thinking? And that goes in the other way as well. I think a lot of libertarians have been inclined to write off and grossly exaggerate, what they see as the flaws of common good conservatives. And in fact, I would even object a little bit to some of your formulations in our last round of questions, Jeff, about, increasing the size of the federal government, whatever. I mean, some of that, rhetoric does seep into common good conservative discussions. And it's kind of, I don't want to call it trolling, but it certainly is a way of just kind of throwing some fireworks out there and, kind of shaking things up. But, fundamentally, I don't think either, conservative libertarians or common good conservatives are interested just in the size of government for its own sake. What they're interested in fundamentally is what is our nature as human beings, what is good for us as human beings, and what role does the common good and the polity play within that natural framework. And that's, I think, something that philosophers have been debating now for well over 2,000 years. So it's not going to be resolved easily. And there are people who think they have all the answers, but they'll find out in practice they don't. But there certainly are deep resources we can draw upon, whether it's within Catholic social thought or whether it's within the sort of classical Aristotelian and Platonic traditions, or whether it's in the tradition of a modern thinker like Edmund Burke or Adam Smith or David Hume. There are important thoughts in all of these groups that need to be considered seriously and can't just be dismissed as some sort of straw man, as either theocracy on the one hand or libertinism on the other. There are actually much more serious, responsible people on all of these different intellectual traditions.
Wow, I don't think I've actually ever trolled before, so that's kind of cool.
Well, I don't mean you were trolled. What I'm saying is that I think there's this tendency in popular discourse.
Twitter, maybe this is the time for me to get back on. I don't know.
There's a tendency in the popular discourse in the press to kind of let the discussion and the sort of quips kind of take on a momentum of their own. And that's fun. And that can be good on Twitter and it can be good on editorial pages sometimes. But there's a need also to kind of scale back and again say, wait a minute, these are, friends that you're dealing with for the most part. And what is the basis of that friendship, even if your friend is completely wrong about his ideas? And from there, you can start building a common good.
Yeah, it's very Augustinian. I approve. Daniel Pitt. He's from England, so we have at least one or maybe more participants from England. Daniel chimes in. I am interested by what Daniel has why Daniel has his Twitter handle. Speaking of Twitter, okay, here we go. I'm interested by why Daniel has his Twitter handle as Tory anarchist. Does this express his political philosophy? If so, how?
Well, it expresses a certain, maybe a political ideal on two levels, one of which is sort of purely abstract and is just saying, you know what, if people were angels who were close to angels, then you would have, the smallest possible state. So in a sense, if you want to be an anarchist, you should be a Tory and you should have the highest possible standards. And you should not only have high standards yourself, you should try to inculcate them within society, because the more that those standards prevail within society, the less need there is for the use of force to try to adjust things. But that, again, is kind of just a very broad and abstract view. There's also a part of a sort of political history and tradition that I'm referring to. I mentioned earlier this book edited by Robert Crundon called The Superfluous Men. And a number of the thinkers included in there are people who either referred to themselves or came later to be referred to as Tory anarchists. And it's a label that has been applied in a kind of loose way to any number of thinkers, ranging from Albert J. Nock to George Orwell to Florence King and to a number of others. And, I, especially earlier on, I found that label and that tradition very interesting and very very difficult to pigeonhole in the way that so much else gets stereotyped and pigeonholed these days. And so a Tory anarchist, being such a paradoxical label, I think serves a good function in trying to get people to think seriously, what is Toryism, what is anarchism, what is the state about, what are the institutions that shape us as human beings about. So I think it does a lot of good. Now, it obviously also sounds a little bit silly also, which that can work both ways as well. On the one hand, it can be embarrassing sometimes, but it also, I think, helps to add a little element of levity and a little element of just not thinking of everything as so serious that you can't enjoy a paradox now and again.
So as editors of Modern Age go, you start with Russell Kirk, Bohemian Tory, and go right directly to Daniel McCarthy, Tory anarchist. I don't think the other editors in between had really good handles. I mean, I'm invoking my vast knowledge of 1970 CB lingo. Yeah,
George Panichas was a new humanist, which is a label that also might require some explanation these days. Yeah, I think. But Bohemian Tory also, I think, gets across much of the same idea from Russell Kirk himself.
Andrew Thornbrook has a Scrutonian question. Roger Scruton said that conservatism arises from the sentiment that good things are easily destroyed, but not easily created. How might conservatives better express this position to non-conservatives and demonstrate the specific goods that our cultural institutions preserve?
Yeah, that is a good question and a hard question, one that doesn't lend itself to an easy soundbite. I mean, obviously, a large part of it is in education. You have to actually, raise these questions. First of all, people have to know that they shouldn't take for granted everything they enjoy today in terms of, a high civilization, a civilization in which people are, safer than almost anywhere else in the world. This was not something that just happened, and it didn't just happen because people were sort of complacent and, Providence happened to hand this down, without any kind of effort on the part of us. And I don't want to get into, sort of Calvinist or Catholic theology there, but clearly, I mean, it took, serious people, statesmen, philosophers, teachers, parents, educators, to build the kind of world that we have, not just in America, but also, within the West as a whole. And if you don't understand that, if you think that, well, the default position of all of humanity is high civilization and a humane approach to conflict and, sort of a nice kind of prosperous and safe existence, any look at history would totally disprove that. And any look around the world would totally disprove that as well. I mean, you can look at the amount of violence and the amount of poverty that exists almost everywhere else, and you can say that, Western civilization, despite its quite serious flaws, nonetheless is succeeding in ways that some other places have not succeeded. And if we don't take seriously the idea that we need to conserve and keep regenerating these successful qualities within our civilization, then they will decline. And that we are, in fact, we're not intrinsically any better than anyone else. We're not exceptional in terms of, what we are in terms of human nature. We are exceptional only because of, we've had good fortune, yes, but we've also worked very hard, and we've had the right kind of ideas, the right faiths and the right values that have steered us. And as we lose track of those things and begin to replace them with others and with, a sort of omnivorous and, sort of all comprehensively destructive postmodern critique, you may find that you no longer have the resources that actually sustain your civilization and your way of life. This is something I really think progressives need to take seriously. Because, they criticize America for its failings, and there's plenty to criticize. But at the same time, they, have certain sentimental objections, perhaps, to what the Chinese are doing to Tibet. But they really don't have any kind of critique that's going to stop the growth of the kind of managerial power, this sort of post-communist communism that you see, explicitly in China, but, to a greater or lesser extent in many other places as well. There really is an ongoing struggle for the nature of a polity. And, the American idea is something that can still fail. And there are other ideas out there that can take its place. Francis Fukuyama was mistaken to say that we've reached the end of history.
That's for sure. The great Rick Avramenko, University of Wisconsin, weighs in with a question. What do you think of the future of conservatism on American campuses? Which is to say, and what is the future of conservatism in the ruling elite apparatchik? Chicky, as he writes. A little extra I there at the end.
Yeah. So I have been off campus long enough now that I don't have a really confident answer about the state of American conservatism on campuses. I know that Rich himself, has a very good center which is able to, keep alive a lot of classical liberal thought and a lot of conservative thought that would otherwise be neglected. And, there is good work being done by a number of centers which are not academic departments, but are affiliated with universities loosely or more closely in a variety of fashions that are, they're a university within a university or a university on the outskirts of a university, but they're trying to fill in the gaps that the university has created. In terms of students, I'm actually sort of pleasantly surprised. A lot of young people, a lot of young conservatives who come to Washington, D.C., really are, especially nowadays, much more philosophically grounded and much more alert to the threat to our civilization than the students I was familiar with, 10 or even 20 years ago were. Conservatives could be pretty complacent even in the 2000s. And even in the 2010s, they were not yet willing to go deep enough. They were still thinking in kind of narrow or shallow political terms. Whereas nowadays, I'm amazed by the depth of reading and the deep thought that a number of young people are doing as they, work within the conservative movement as they graduate from their colleges and universities, which again goes to show the power of autodidacticism and the power of institutions like ISI in reaching these students and making the resources available to them for them to fend off the attacks coming to them from all sides. But institutionally, I think it's a very dire situation. And clearly, the university is becoming less and less tolerant of dissenting views. Even the New York Times op-ed page is becoming less and less tolerant of dissenting views. And of course, the whole function of an op-ed page is precisely, classically, to have a wide variety of views, some of which, the editors disagree with. So if that's happening, there's a sense in which the entire country is becoming like a big university campus now in the worst respects. And I fear that the universities themselves are perhaps even further along in this kind of Maoist degeneration.
Yes. Roy Miller has a question. We're coming down to it, so we've got time, but I'm just lost it for a sec. Okay, I got it. Is libertarian today the same as conservative of yesterday? To which I might add, what is this state capacity libertarianism? Sounds somewhat conservative. So maybe that's kind of what he's getting at too.
I may ask you to repeat the question, but I'll start off with state capacity libertarianism and a few related questions. There has been this tendency over the last 10 or 20 years for a number of libertarians to look for ways in which they can basically become modern progressive liberals. Now, that may not be exactly what Tyler Cowen's trying to do with his idea of state capacity libertarianism, which is a libertarianism that accepts, a sort of larger role for the federal government and whatnot. But it's certainly something you saw with Rawlsianism, this attempt to build a bridge between F.A. Hayek and John Rawls. It's something you saw with this larger project called libertarianism. And the funny thing is that the progressive liberals just don't have any use for these libertarians. Some, elite libertarians are kind of eager to be accepted by progressive liberals, but progressive liberals have nothing to gain by conceding anything to the libertarians. And property rights is something, I think Richard Weaver was the one who called property rights the last metaphysical right. Property rights are something that conservatives going back to Cicero in the dying days of the Roman Republic have been willing to stand up for. It seems to me that when libertarians move away from their discourse with conservatives and try instead to enter into a discourse with the left, they're going to wind up losing their anchorage in property rights, and they're going to wind up becoming not only indistinguishable from the left, but basically the kind of the most servile element of the left, because the left really has an agenda, a revolutionary agenda, that no libertarian is ever going to be able to compete with. Now,
in the wake of the pandemic, it seems like a lot of people began getting reintroduced to the benefits of the Federalist tradition. Does federalism matter more now than ever in the wake of the coronavirus?
Yeah, both the coronavirus and also the protests and sort of demonstrations, which often become violent, that we're seeing right now. All of these things are fundamentally and in the first order states' issues and local issues. Police forces are local. States have responsibility for public health and safety. The federal government role in these things is not meant to be one of micromanaging and trying to solve every problem. But of course, there's been an ideological tendency on the part of the left to say that what happens in all of these localities is in fact part of such an overwhelming national problem that the localities should simply be forgotten about or downplayed, and that everything has to be the responsibility not only of the federal government, but really just of the White House itself and of the executive branch of the federal government. And, even though they despise Donald Trump, progressives like this idea of concentrating power and putting all responsibility in the center. And they like it because, I think the whole progressive project for being able to rule the future depends precisely on loosening people from their traditional ties to one another, whether in the family or whether in the neighborhood, the local community, even at the level of just state government institutions. All of these things are enemies of a new universal creed of power. And that's what I think the left fundamentally is at this point. It is it wears a cloak of rationalism, but really it's a new form of religion.
We're getting to the end. I'll have maybe one more question here, and it reads: Benjamin Disraeli in Coningsby, those great novels, wrote that, quote, "There was indeed a considerable shouting about what they called conservative principles, but the awkward question naturally arose: what will you conserve?" That is my question. What should conservatives conserve?
Well, in politics, you conserve the commonwealth, you conserve the common good, and you conserve the citizenry. Those are the chief things that you conservatives have to aim towards within the political framework. Conservatism, as a broader sort of literary and philosophical goal, has to also think about conserving the civilizational roots that make possible the kind of polity that we have. And that means, elements of our philosophy, elements of our religious tradition. And it's because these things are often dynamic and in conflict with one another, there's always going to be a need for ongoing effort here. It's not something that can ever be reduced to a formula. And I think that's one of the key things to understand about conservatism. It's why Russell Kirk said conservatism is not an ideology. It's actually an ongoing attempt to defend a way of life.
That's great. Well, that's the end of, I think we're running out of time, and I'm stammering a little bit because I have to look at 14 things at the same time. And one of them is good, though. Well, they're all good. But there was a raffle associated with this particular webinar. 10 lucky people get a free year subscription to Modern Age. Hallelujah. And I believe I am just finding it. And here we go. Thanks to my producer out there in the shadows, James Davenport and Joseph Cunningham. They surfaced the winners. And the winners are, you'll hear from us. You'll get an email. Maybe if you ask nicely, Dan will put in an autographed, glossy.
I have had people ask me for my autograph, including a Australian Marxist at one point. So, I've signed copies of Modern Age for them.
Sign whatever they put in front of you. That's the author's dictum. All right, here we go. The winners are Susan M. Logan, John Hillen, Doug Bandow. Wow, Doug Bandow. What a great... And I didn't even get to ask you a question that I want to do about Randolph Bourne and Robert Taft and the whole old right, non-interventionist tradition, which, I absorbed a lot, and I always appreciated your work in that area with American conservatism. Doug Bandow is one of our great champions and voices in ISI circles for that tradition.
Well, and I should mention, Jeff, as some folks here will know, wrote an introduction to Russell Kirk's book on Robert Taft and Foreign Policy for America. So this is a tradition that really is very much alive and in need of being rediscovered. Yeah,
I agree. So Doug Bandow, Leela Canulas, Daniel Pitt. All right, you scored by coming in from Great Britain tonight, Daniel. Kevin Dong, James Ward, Scott Pentecost, Timothy Campbell, and Ross Van Farrow. So I think I think I got everybody. That seems like 10. So congratulations, everybody. You're going to have a great year reading Modern Age, because it's an age for Modern Age, time to conserve and preserve the permanent things. We also have, just before I say goodbye to Dan, Conservative Conversations with ISI will continue in 2 weeks, June 18th with Jonah Goldberg. Then after that, just before the 4th of July, July 2nd with Robert P. George of Princeton. And after that, we'll have a conversation, a kind of debate between Victor Clark and Oren Cass on the role of the government in the economy. So that should be an interesting discussion, topical. And in early August, August 5th, Anthony Schlaze will talk about the lessons for today from the Great Depression and the Great Society. Robbie George, of course, will be talking about the natural law and natural rights on July 4th. How much more perfect than that lineup. Dan, what's in store with you in Modern Age? What's coming up? What do we should we know about?
Well, we have a phenomenal look at the films of the lockdown by our new film and theater critic, Noah Millman. He has written an absolutely outstanding sort of review essay about films where families had to isolate from the rest of society and had to survive, or had to sort of endure one another's company, or had to find, a kind of way of living and a way of attaining the good, even when they've been cut off from everyone else. So, and that includes everything from horror films to dramas to other things. So it's an essay that really knocked my socks off. And our managing editor, Anthony Sacramone, who's also a great film buff, he was just blown away by it as well. So I think readers are going to be very impressed. We also have an essay which connects the sort of classic and the modern, in the sense that it is an essay on Edmund Burke and Donald Trump. What would Burke make of Donald Trump? Is Trump, a kind of defiance of everything Burkean, or is there in fact a certain common ground? And that's written by Ian Crow, one of the great Burke scholars of our time. And we also have just a wealth of other things that I'm so excited about. That I'm glad we have people who've won subscriptions, because they're going to be really happy, I think, with what they see.
Yeah, and their happiness is not just owed to Dan, who we've sung his praises, of course, but he mentioned Anthony Sacramone, the manager, Jed Donahue here, our vice president of publications, and really keeps things going as an editor also of Modern Age with Anthony, Joseph Cunningham behind the scenes, and of course, your wonderful literary editor, really great, Sam Goldman's always interesting and brings so much to the journal. And your poetry editor, you've got a poetry editor, James Matthew Wilson of Villanova. We have a poetry editor, and he's one of the outstanding talents of his generation. You have outstanding talents everywhere you look. You, Sam, JMW, it's all good. All right, Dan, well, thanks for spending time in the night. Thanks, everybody, for being with us for this episode of Conservative Conversations with ISI. We'll see you next time with Jonah Goldberg. Take care, everyone, and good night.